July 1967, Long Beach, California. The air inside the convention hall was thick with noise. Hundreds of martial artists had gathered for the International Karate Championships. Black belts, tournament champions, fighters who had spent their entire lives proving one thing to the world, that they were the best. And somewhere in the middle of that crowd stood a man who many believed already was. Chuck Norris, 6 feet tall, solid. A former Air Force veteran who had built a reputation inside the tournament world as something close to unstoppable. His kicks were brutal, his conditioning legendary. And inside the competitive karate circuit of the late 1960s, there were very few names spoken with more respect. But that afternoon, someone else had arrived, a smaller man, quiet, lean, almost unimpressive to the untrained eye. He weighed barely 140 pounds, and most of the fighters walking past him didn't even recognize who he was. His name was Bruce Lee, and before the day ended, one sentence would be spoken, a sentence that would spread across dojos, training halls, and martial arts schools around the world for decades, a sentence spoken by Chuck Norris himself. But to understand why that sentence mattered, we have to go back to the moment everything began, because the story didn't start with a fight. It started with a laugh. And if you're wondering how a laugh could lead to one of the most talked-about martial arts encounters ever, stay with me. Because what happened next, nobody in that room expected. Chuck Norris was already a rising force inside the American karate world. After serving in the U.S. Air Force in Korea, he had discovered martial arts and devoted himself to it completely. What started as curiosity became obsession, and obsession became dominance. Tournament after tournament, Chuck won. 1965, 1966, 1967. Names that once intimidated other fighters quickly became names Chuck defeated. His style was clean, powerful, and efficient, a mix of Tang Soo Do and traditional karate that focused on precision and force. But Chuck also carried something else: confidence, the kind of confidence that only comes from winning over and over again. By the time the Long Beach International Karate Championships arrived that year, many people in the American martial arts world already believed Chuck Norris was the future of competitive fighting. And Chuck wasn't shy about it either. Inside locker rooms, training halls, demonstration stages, he spoke openly about strength, about discipline, about what it took to survive inside a real fight. And if someone asked him about flashy techniques or dramatic demonstrations, Chuck had a simple opinion. Most of it was nonsense. But that afternoon, someone was about to challenge that belief. Across the convention floor, Bruce Lee moved quietly through the crowd. If you didn't know who he was, you might have mistaken him for a college student. He wasn't particularly tall. His clothes were simple, his expression calm. But those who had already seen him move knew something different. Bruce had arrived in America several years earlier from Hong Kong. And while most martial artists were still locked inside rigid traditions, Bruce was already questioning everything. Why punch this way? Why kick that way? Why limit movement? Why follow rules that didn't make sense in a real fight? Inside his small Seattle school, Bruce had begun developing something radical, a philosophy built on speed, efficiency, and adaptability. Later, the world would call it Jeet Kune Do. But in 1967, most fighters had never even heard the term. All they saw was a skinny Chinese instructor who moved strangely fast. And that unfamiliarity created something predictable: skepticism. The first moment Chuck Norris noticed Bruce Lee came during a demonstration break. Several fighters had gathered near a practice mat where Bruce was showing a small group of students a hand technique. It didn't look dramatic. There were no spinning kicks, no loud shouts, just a short forward movement of the arm. A strike that stopped less than an inch from a student's chest. Chuck watched from the edge of the group. For a moment, he said nothing. But eventually he stepped closer, crossed his arms, and studied the movement again. Bruce demonstrated it once more. A straight punch, explosive, direct, over almost instantly. Chuck shook his head slightly. Then he spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. That wouldn't work in a real fight. The small group around Bruce went silent. Bruce looked up. His expression didn't change. Chuck stepped closer to the mat. He wasn't angry. In fact, he almost looked amused. "Speed demonstrations are nice," Chuck continued, "but fighting someone your size is one thing." He paused, then nodded toward Bruce. "But standing in front of someone bigger—" Chuck's voice carried a slight edge now. "That's different." Several fighters nearby shifted their attention toward the two men. Bruce remained calm, his hands resting loosely at his sides. Chuck studied him for another moment, then said the line that would later become famous. "Stand 10 seconds against me," Chuck said, "and I'll call you Master." A ripple of laughter moved through the nearby crowd. It wasn't cruel laughter, but it was confident. The kind of laughter that comes when the outcome already feels obvious. Chuck Norris outweighed Bruce Lee by more than 30 pounds. He was taller, stronger, and at that moment, he was one of the most feared tournament fighters in America. Bruce Lee was still an unknown instructor from Seattle, and in the minds of many people watching, this wasn't even a contest. But Bruce didn't react the way they expected. He didn't argue. He didn't defend his reputation. He didn't even explain his philosophy. Instead, he asked a single question. 10 seconds? Chuck nodded. That's right. Bruce looked around the room. Dozens of fighters had now gathered, some curious, some amused, some skeptical. Then Bruce looked back at Chuck, and for the first time, he smiled. Not a mocking smile, not a challenging one, just a small, quiet smile. "As you wish," Bruce said, and suddenly the laughter stopped, because the room had begun to understand something. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It was about to become a test, and nobody in that room had any idea how that test would end. The practice mat cleared quickly. Word spread across the convention hall. Chuck Norris, Bruce Lee, a challenge. Fighters drifted toward the area. Some climbed onto nearby bleachers. Others leaned against walls. A few instructors folded their arms and watched carefully. Because even if they didn't know Bruce Lee, they knew Chuck Norris. And if Chuck Norris was stepping onto a mat, something serious was about to happen. Chuck removed his jacket and handed it to a nearby student. His posture relaxed, but his eyes were focused now. This wasn't a joke anymore. Across the mat, Bruce Lee stood quietly. No warm-up, no stretching, just breathing slowly. Chuck noticed something strange immediately. Bruce didn't look nervous, not even slightly. Most fighters, when facing someone larger, displayed small signs of tension. A tight jaw, shifting feet, shallow breathing. Bruce had none of those. He looked comfortable. Chuck stepped onto the mat. Bruce followed. They stopped about 6 feet apart. The room had gone silent. One of the tournament assistants stepped forward. He wasn't acting as an official referee, but someone needed to mark the moment. He raised his hand. 10 seconds, he said. Chuck nodded once. Bruce said nothing. The assistant looked at both men, then dropped his hand. "Begin." And in the very first second, something happened that nobody in the room expected. But before we get into that moment, Chuck Norris moved first. That alone surprised nobody. Inside tournament fighting, Chuck had built his reputation on decisive openings. He didn't hesitate. He didn't circle endlessly. When the moment arrived, he stepped in and took control. And that was exactly what he did now. His front foot slid forward, his shoulders rotated. A fast, probing strike came toward Bruce's center line. Not a full power blow, just a test, a way to measure reaction time. But the strike never landed, because Bruce Lee wasn't there. He hadn't stepped back. He hadn't blocked. Instead, he had shifted just a few inches off-line, barely noticeable. Chuck's fist passed through empty air, and for the first time that afternoon, Chuck Norris blinked. It wasn't confusion, not yet, just a small recalculation. Inside tournament fighting, missed strikes happen all the time. Fighters adjust. They reset. They try again. So Chuck did exactly that. His weight shifted forward again, this time faster. His second movement was a combination. A back fist followed immediately by a roundhouse setup. A sequence that had dropped many opponents before they could react. But Bruce Lee didn't retreat. He moved forward, just slightly, his body sliding into a narrow angle beside Chuck's strike. And suddenly, Chuck's second attack missed too. The room grew quieter, not dramatically, but enough that several fighters exchanged glances. 2 strikes, 2 clean misses, against someone who wasn't even attacking yet. Chuck adjusted his stance. His expression changed slightly. Still confident, but now more focused, because Chuck Norris had spent years learning one critical truth about fighting. When something unusual happens early in a match, you pay attention. He stepped again, but this time he slowed the pace, circling, testing distance. Bruce mirrored the movement, light, balanced, his feet barely making sound against the mat. And something else was becoming clear to everyone watching. Bruce Lee wasn't reacting to Chuck Norris. He was reading him. Every shift of weight, every change of angle, every muscle tightening before a strike. Chuck saw it too. The realization didn't hit all at once. It arrived slowly, like a faint signal growing louder. The man in front of him was watching everything. So Chuck decided to remove the distance completely, because when speed and angles become unpredictable, power solves the problem. He lunged forward, closing the gap, his arms reaching to trap Bruce's movement, a wrestler's instinct. Once Chuck secured control of Bruce's upper body, the 10 seconds would be over, but Bruce Lee stepped inside the motion, not away from it, inside, and suddenly Chuck felt something unexpected. Contact, not a strike, a touch. Bruce's hand had met Chuck's wrist, not grabbing, not blocking, just guiding. 2 inches, that was all, but those 2 inches changed everything. Chuck's momentum carried forward, his body rotated slightly off balance, and before he could recover, Bruce Lee had moved again. A short strike, barely visible. It landed lightly against Chuck's shoulder, not painful, but precise, and the message was clear. I could have hit you. Chuck stepped back immediately, not from fear, from awareness, because now the calculation had changed. This wasn't a 10-second challenge anymore. This was a problem. And Chuck Norris had built his entire career solving problems inside a fight. But the clock was already moving. 3 seconds. 4. 5. The room had gone completely silent now. No laughter, no whispers, only the soft sound of movement on the mat. Chuck launched another attack, this time faster, a low kick, followed by a straight punch aimed directly at Bruce's chest, but Bruce shifted again. Not dramatically, just enough. Chuck's kick struck empty space, his punch missed by inches, and Bruce Lee stepped behind him. Behind him, Chuck turned instantly, but by the time he faced forward again, Bruce was already back at center distance, standing calmly, breathing evenly, as if the entire exchange had cost him almost no effort. The crowd watching from the edge of the mat had begun to understand something. This wasn't about strength, or size, or even aggression. It was about timing. And Bruce Lee's timing was different. 6 seconds. Chuck felt the pressure now, not physical pressure, mental pressure, because every fighter knows one thing about time. The more you think about it, the faster it disappears. Chuck stepped forward again, but this time Bruce moved first. A quick step inward, closer than Chuck expected, and then a blur. 3 movements, so fast that several spectators would later disagree about what they had actually seen. A finger jab stopping an inch from Chuck's eyes, a palm strike frozen just before his chest, and a kick that halted a hair's width from Chuck's ribs. None of them landed, but they didn't need to, because the message had already been delivered. Perfect control, perfect distance, perfect timing. Chuck Norris stood still, just for a moment, and in that moment, the assistant who had started the challenge looked down at his watch, then looked up again. 10 seconds. The words echoed quietly through the room, and suddenly the realization spread. Chuck Norris had issued the challenge. Stand 10 seconds against me, and I'll call you master. Bruce Lee had done more than stand. He had controlled the entire exchange, without throwing a single full-power strike, without raising his voice, without showing the slightest hint of strain. Chuck exhaled slowly. The tension left his shoulders, and then something happened that nobody expected. Chuck Norris smiled. Not the confident smile from earlier, a different one, the smile of someone who has just discovered something real. He stepped forward and extended his hand. Bruce Lee looked at it for a moment, then took it. Chuck nodded once. You lasted 10 seconds, he said. Then he paused, and I learned something. The fighters around the mat leaned closer, because Chuck Norris was not known for handing out compliments, especially in the middle of a challenge. Chuck looked Bruce Lee directly in the eyes and spoke the sentence that many people in that room would remember for the rest of their lives. Master. The word was simple, but inside martial arts, it carried weight. The tension broke. Several fighters began talking at once. Some laughed in disbelief. Others nodded slowly, because what they had just witnessed wasn't a victory or a defeat. It was something rarer, recognition. Chuck Norris picked up his jacket, but before leaving the mat he turned once more toward Bruce. You move differently, Chuck said. Bruce tilted his head slightly. Different is good. Chuck nodded. Then he added something else, something that would quietly shape the future of martial arts. We should train together sometime. Bruce Lee smiled again. Any time. And in the years that followed, they did, many times. The two men would spar, train, exchange ideas, and push each other to become better fighters. What began as a moment of doubt became one of the most respected friendships in martial arts history. Years later, when Chuck Norris spoke publicly about Bruce Lee, his tone was always the same, respectful, admiring, because Chuck had learned something important that day. Strength matters, skill matters, but understanding movement, understanding timing, understanding the space between two fighters, that was something else entirely. Bruce Lee once said, Knowing is not enough. We must apply. Willing is not enough. We must do. And on that afternoon in Long Beach, Chuck Norris saw exactly what that meant. Not through words, not through theory, but through 10 quiet seconds on a training mat. 10 seconds that began with laughter and ended with respect. And maybe you've experienced a moment like that too. A moment when someone underestimated you. A moment when people thought they already knew how the story would end. So the real question is, what did you do next? Chuck Norris didn't leave the mat immediately. For a few seconds, after saying the word master, he simply stood there, watching, studying, because something inside his mind was still processing what had just happened. Inside competitive karate, Chuck had fought hundreds of exchanges, fast ones, brutal ones, ones that ended with clean strikes and decisive victories. But this had been different. Bruce Lee hadn't fought him, not really. He hadn't attacked. He hadn't countered with force. He had simply controlled the space between them, and that realization was beginning to settle in. The small group of fighters surrounding the mat slowly broke their silence. One instructor leaned toward another and whispered, "Did he even throw a punch?" Another shook his head. "No, he didn't need to." Across the room, a few younger students were already talking excitedly, trying to replay what they had just seen. But the more they described it, the more confusing it sounded, because what Bruce Lee had done didn't look impressive in the usual way. There were no spinning kicks, no loud impacts, no dramatic takedown, just movement, small, efficient, precise, and yet somehow the result had been undeniable. Chuck Norris had issued the challenge, 10 seconds, and Bruce Lee had controlled every one of them. Chuck stepped off the mat and walked toward the side of the room. Several fighters approached him almost immediately. "Chuck, what happened there? Did he hit you? Was he faster than he looked?" Chuck didn't answer right away. He grabbed his jacket, took a sip of water, then finally spoke. "He's not faster." The group leaned closer. "He's earlier." The sentence confused them. "What does that mean?" someone asked. Chuck thought for a moment, then explained, "When I move, he already knows." A few fighters frowned. Chuck continued, "It's like he reads the start of the motion before the motion happens." Another instructor nodded slowly. That explanation made sense, because inside high-level fighting, there are only two ways to beat speed. You either move faster or you move sooner. And Bruce Lee was doing the second. Across the room, Bruce Lee had returned to the small group of students he had been teaching earlier. There was no celebration, no victory speech. He simply continued explaining the same technique as if nothing unusual had happened. A straight punch, direct, explosive, economical. One student finally asked the question everyone was thinking. "Did you know you could beat him?" Bruce paused, then shook his head slightly. "That wasn't the point." The student looked confused. Bruce continued, "If I try to beat someone, I am fighting the person." He tapped the student's shoulder gently. "But if I understand movement, the fight disappears." The student blinked. Bruce smiled. "I wasn't fighting Chuck Norris. I was responding to energy." The explanation sounded philosophical, almost abstract, but several experienced fighters listening nearby understood exactly what he meant. Bruce Lee wasn't reacting emotionally. He was reacting mechanically, to timing, to balance, to intention, and that made him incredibly difficult to fight. Meanwhile, Chuck Norris was still thinking. Because fighters often experience a strange moment after a match, a moment when they replay every movement, every strike, every decision, trying to understand what worked and what didn't. Chuck replayed the first exchange in his mind, the missed punch, the missed kick, the moment Bruce stepped inside his reach. And suddenly, something became clear. Bruce Lee hadn't been avoiding his attacks. He had been guiding them, redirecting the energy, making Chuck move into positions where balance disappeared. Chuck exhaled slowly. Then he laughed. One of the fighters nearby looked surprised. "What's funny?" Chuck shook his head. "I thought he was doing tricks." "And?" Chuck looked across the room toward Bruce. "He's doing science." Later that afternoon, the tournament continued. Matches resumed, demonstrations carried on. But inside the building, one quiet story had already begun spreading. Chuck Norris, Bruce Lee, 10 seconds. The story moved through locker rooms, through training circles, through instructors whispering to students, and with every retelling, one detail stayed the same. Chuck Norris had called Bruce Lee master. But the most interesting part of the story didn't happen that day. It happened later, much later, because Chuck Norris never forgot the lesson. In fact, it changed the way he trained. Instead of focusing only on power and conditioning, Chuck began studying movement more deeply. Timing, distance, flow. And during the years that followed, Chuck Norris and Bruce Lee would meet again. Not as rivals, but as training partners. They sparred. They exchanged ideas, they discussed philosophy. And slowly, a friendship formed. A friendship built on mutual respect. Years later, when Bruce Lee was preparing for a movie called The Way of the Dragon, he made an unusual decision. He wanted the final fight scene to feel real, authentic. He didn't want an actor pretending to fight. He wanted a real martial artist. So Bruce Lee called Chuck Norris, and Chuck accepted. The scene would be filmed in Rome, inside the ancient Colosseum. 2 fighters, no audience, no referees, just movement, just skill, just the echo of footsteps against stone. When the film released in 1972, that final fight scene became legendary. Not because it was flashy, but because it was honest. 2 martial artists respecting each other, testing each other, learning from each other. Years after Bruce Lee's passing, Chuck Norris would speak about him many times, and every time, his voice carried the same tone, respect, because Chuck understood something few people did. Bruce Lee wasn't just a great fighter, he was a different kind of thinker. A man who saw martial arts not as a collection of techniques, but as a living system. Something that evolved, something that adapted, something that refused to stay trapped inside tradition. And Chuck Norris had been one of the first people in America to witness that difference up close, on a simple training mat, during 10 quiet seconds. Bruce Lee once wrote a line in his personal notes, "Empty your mind. Be formless. Be like water." At the time, many people didn't fully understand what he meant, but Chuck Norris did, because he had felt it. That strange moment when every attack misses, when the opponent seems to move before the strike begins, when control belongs not to strength, but to awareness. And maybe the most important part of this story isn't the challenge, or the 10 seconds, or even the word master. Maybe it's what happened afterward, because real martial artists understand something. Respect isn't earned by winning, it's earned by understanding. Chuck Norris understood Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee respected Chuck Norris, and that respect created one of the most famous martial arts friendships in history. But here's the interesting part. Most people only remember the movie fight in the Colosseum, the dramatic kicks, the cinematic ending. Very few people remember the small moment that happened years earlier, the moment when Chuck Norris looked at a smaller man on a training mat and realized something he hadn't expected. Sometimes the most dangerous fighter in the room is the one nobody notices at first, and if you've ever walked into a room where people underestimated you, then you already understand this story, because the real power Bruce Lee showed that day wasn't just skill, it was composure, confidence, and the quiet certainty that he didn't need to prove anything loudly. Sometimes 10 seconds is enough, and sometimes 10 seconds can change the way the entire room thinks. So now I'm curious, if you had been standing in that room that day, watching Chuck Norris issue that challenge, what would you have expected to happen? Let me know in the comments.